He came to that planet as a war advisor, but the moment he looked into her eyes, he felt something was wrong. Familiar, intimate, terrifyingly so. Kael, a human war veteran burdened with blood-stained memories and past betrayals, is sent to the royal homeworld of the Zerathi as a final diplomatic move to preserve the fragile alliance between their species. The Zerathi are not known for kindness. They feel emotions through skin contact, and they despise chaos. Worse, they despise whatever storm Kael carries within him. Amid cold stares and courtly suspicion, Lira, a highborn warrior and daughter of royal blood, doesn't understand why her heart falters every time their fingers brush, as if her body remembers something her mind cannot. Both try to ignore it, but when their hands meet in the stillness of the palace corridor, a memory not their own ignites within them. A voice from deep within Kael's blood whispers, "You were never meant to love her." And as war looms and long-buried genetic secrets begin to surface, their love becomes not just forbidden, it becomes the one thing that could unravel an empire. The corridor glowed with a quiet, otherworldly elegance. Crystalline structures hung motionless in the air, pulsing faintly like the breath of the palace itself. Light spilled from them in soft wave-shifting, shimmering, never still, casting ghostly patterns along the obsidian walls and the silver inlays of the floor. Lira moved with the grace of a creature born to rule measured steps, straight spine, eyes fixed ahead. Her armor, delicate yet unyielding, caught the light in flickering halos, wrapping her in an aura both ethereal and untouchable. She didn't speak. She never needed to. Silence followed her like a second skin. Kael walked just behind her, his presence heavier, too solid for this place. The crisp echo of his boots was a foreign beat against the rhythm of this world, the faintest reminder that he did not belong here. Not truly. Then, as they turned a corner lined with floating prisms, it happened. A brush, a breath. His fingers grazed the inside of her wrist. A mistake, innocent, unplanned. But the moment their skin met, everything inside them shifted. A flash behind the eyes. A flicker of something neither of them could name. Pain, desire, a child's cry, blood on stone, the smell of fire and soft hair and sorrow. The images didn't make sense, but they clung to the mind like smoke, familiar, yet wrong. Like remembering a dream you never had, or hearing your own name spoken by a stranger in the dark. Lira pulled back, breath catching, her eyes narrowing with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't confusion either. She stared at him like he had stepped out of a nightmare she had once forgotten. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, clipped. "You touched me without permission." Kael didn't answer right away. He didn't know how. His hand still hovered, as if reaching into a memory that wasn't his. Finally, with a voice more uncertain than he liked, "Did you feel that too?" She turned, offering no reply, but she didn't deny it. And as they resumed their path through the glowing corridor, neither could escape the silence that now hung between them, thick, heavy, alive with a question neither dared speak aloud. That night, neither slept. They lay in separate rooms, worlds apart, each staring at the ceiling as the phantom touch on their skin refused to fade. And somewhere, buried deep beneath layers of instinct and denial, something inside them had awakened. Something that should have stayed forgotten. Steam curled through the chamber like silk, in slow motion, soft, hypnotic, alive. It clung to the walls, floated through the air, kissed bare stone and metal with equal affection. Every breath tasted warm and ancient, as though the room itself remembered every secret ever whispered within its walls. Kael had no intention of intruding. He turned a corner, unaware that the threshold he crossed wasn't meant for him. The moment his eyes adjusted through the haze, he stopped breathing. There she was, standing beneath a curtain of falling water, her back turned to him, still and unaware, perhaps not. The glow of the mineral stream cast a soft shimmer across her skin, pale silver beneath the cascading light. Each drop traced its way down the curve of her spine, flowing past the faint scar that marked her shoulder like a memory carved in silence. She didn't speak, didn't reach for anything to cover herself. She simply turned her head. Her profile appeared, first high cheekbone, wet strands of hair framing the sharp grace of her face, then her eyes, half-lidded, unreadable, as calm as they were disarming. "In your world," she asked quietly, her voice floating through the mist like something half-dreamed. "Do you fear the body?" Kael swallowed the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Every instinct told him to look away, to apologize and retreat, but he didn't move. Couldn't. Not when the air between them felt heavier than stone. Not when every part of him suddenly ached with the strange weight of being seen. "In mine," he murmured, voice low, strained, "we fear what it awakens." Their eyes met through the steam. No shields, no armor. Just silence and something simmering just beneath the surface, unspoken, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. She didn't blink, didn't smile. She simply watched him, with the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. He took a step back, not because he was afraid of her, but because he was afraid of what might happen if he stayed. She turned again, letting the water reclaim her silhouette. He left without another word, but the heat of that room clung to him long after, more than the steam, more than the memory. Because it wasn't her body that haunted him, it was the stillness, the knowing, and the unshakable truth that he had been the only one exposed. The war table pulsed softly beneath their hands, its light ebbing like the breath of something alive. Tactical overlays hovered in the air, holograms, shifting slowly, silently, indifferent to the tension building between the two people standing just inches apart. Kael stared down at the display, trying to focus on battle routes and fleet trajectories. Numbers, logic, anything to ignore the quiet weight of her presence at his side. But Lira was close, closer than necessary. Her voice reached him not through the room, but through the air between them, low, deliberate, warm against his ear. "We draw them into the second ring," she murmured, "and collapse the corridor once they overextend." The words were sound, strategic, but they weren't what lingered. It was the way she said them, soft enough to be mistaken for something intimate. She leaned in further, just slightly. Her breath touched the side of his neck, heat threading beneath his collar like a promise he wasn't ready to name. Her hand moved next, graceful, unhurried, gliding across the edge of the table until it brushed his. Barely a touch, but enough. His body reacted before thought could intervene. A thrum beneath his skin, a memory that hadn't happened yet. He didn't move. Couldn't. The air was too thick, the moment too sharp. "You need to stop," he said quietly, the words brittle from restraint. Lira tilted her head, her lips a whisper away from a smirk, but her eyes held fire. "Then don't let me win." He turned toward her, slowly, deliberately, catching her wrist before she could pull away. His hand pressed hers flat against the table, not forcefully, but with just enough weight to remind them both that control was still being fought for. Their faces were close now, close enough that the air between them felt thin. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't soften. She wasn't seducing him, she was testing him. And God's help him, she was winning. He didn't kiss her, but not because he didn't want to. It was because if he did, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop. The room was silent, but it pulsed with something louder than noise, something restless, coiled, waiting to break. And though the war outside raged on, the true battle had already started right here, beneath his skin. The lower archives weren't built for visitors, they were built to be forgotten. Kael stepped into the vault like crossing into the marrow of the planet itself. Cold light filtered from veins of crystal embedded in the walls, pulsing faintly, like the heartbeat of something ancient that refused to die. Everything here smelled of dust, in sterilized silence. No guards, no voices, just him, the soft echo of his breath, and the quiet weight of secrets sealed in glass. He moved slowly between rows of bloodline cylinders, each one humming softly in its cradle of generations, reduced to strands of code, glowing like trapped stars behind reinforced glass. His hand hovered over the access console, then settled. A breath. A scan. The machine responded with a whisper, almost hesitant. Lineage match confirmed. Royal Tier 2 active. The words didn't land at first. He stared at the screen, waiting for it to correct itself, but it didn't. He leaned in closer. "That's not possible." The interface blinked. Then a file opened. A profile, archived and sealed 63 years prior. She appeared without fanfare. A static image, old but sharp, regal, composed, and far too familiar. His breath caught. She wasn't Lira, but the symmetry was undeniable. Bone structure, eyes like polished frost, the same curve to her jaw when she wasn't smiling. Her name meant nothing to him. Her face meant everything. The system listed her as part of a terminated genome continuity program, no death record, no known descendants. Lost, not erased. But her DNA was in him. That much was now fact. He stepped back, not in fear yet, but in something colder, something harder to name. It was as if the air around him had thickened, like the archives themselves were suddenly watching, waiting to see what he would do with what he just found. His gaze returned to the image. The resemblance wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't projection. It was blood, old and unspoken, stitched into the spaces between molecules, hiding just beneath the surface of who he thought he was. And now, it had found its way back to the light. The dome above shimmered like a captured sky, starlight washing over the glass in slow, deliberate waves. All around them, the cosmos spun in silence, sea-vast, unknowable, and indifferent. But here, inside the curve of this quiet world, time held its breath. Kael stood motionless beneath the light, waiting not because he didn't know what he wanted, but because he finally feared he did. She came to him without a word. Lira, moving as if drawn forward by something older than choice, something written in their bones. Her steps were soft, but her presence struck him like gravity inescapable, familiar in the most impossible way. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes trembled. Glassy, wide, holding something between sorrow and surrender. She stopped, just close enough for him to feel her breath. There was no permission, no hesitation, only the gentle touch of her brow to his, the brush of fingers at the base of his neck, the kind of closeness that says everything words would only ruin. And then her lips, warm, slow, searching. It wasn't a kiss of hunger, it was mourning, the kind that tried to capture something already slipping through their hands. Their mouths moved with quiet desperation, a rhythm formed not by passion, but by fear that this might be the last time they were allowed to forget the world. His arms wrapped around her without thought. Her body melted into his like it had always belonged there. The glow of the dome dimmed around them, casting their figures in shadow, as if even the light dared not witness what was unfolding. But beneath it all, Kael felt the edge of something sharp. A thought. A whisper of truth scratching beneath his ribs. Not fully formed, not spoken, but present. Like a shadow at the corner of the room, unseen, yet impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just guilt. It was recognition. He didn't pull away, because in that moment, pulling away would make it real, would make the unthinkable true. So he held her and kissed her and tried in vain to silence the voice rising in the back of his mind, the one that said this feeling wasn't just dangerous, it was wrong in a way that had no name. But she didn't know. Not yet. And he wasn't ready to tell her. Because this stolen second of warmth was the last thing that still belonged to them alone. And once the truth stepped into the light, nothing ever would again. The med station was buried far below the palace, out of sight, out of reach, and more importantly, out of questions. The room was dim, pulsing with a faint blue glow that shimmered across sterile walls and humming consoles. It was too clean, too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, it felt staged. Controlled. Like the silence was trying not to breathe too loud. Kael stood still, arms folded tight across his chest, eyes locked on the single screen before him. He had submitted 2 samples. One his own, one hers. He hadn't asked permission, hadn't told her. He wasn't sure if that made him a coward or just someone who needed the truth before it crushed him. The machine whirred softly, lights blinked, algorithms unfolded like clockwork hands. Then, the display stopped. A single line hovered in the center of the screen. No fanfare, no sound cue, just cold, clinical clarity. Genetic match, 47% maternal bloodline. For a second, nothing in the room moved. Not the air, not the light, not him. Just those words burning on the monitor like a scar that had just been cut open. He didn't speak. Not right away. His breath stalled in his throat, held hostage by the weight now sitting in his chest. Every beat of his heart felt too loud, every inch of silence around him too heavy. And then, almost inaudibly, "She's my mother's child?" The words came out brittle, like they didn't want to be spoken, like saying them would make them real. But they were real. The numbers didn't lie. The match was exact. Not close, not theoretical. Confirmed. Maternal. Direct. He staggered back a step, gaze still fixed on the screen as if it might change, as if the machine might blink and say it was wrong. It didn't. The line stayed there, bright, final. And in that stillness, Kael felt something collapse inside him. Not a scream, not a shatter, just a quiet, aching fold as if a part of him had given up trying to understand and had simply gone still. She didn't know. Not yet. But he did. And now, no matter how he tried to hold on to what they had, he would never touch her again without feeling this truth beneath his skin. The light was dim, slow to move, like it too hesitated to touch this moment. Shadows stretched across the walls in soft, uneven patterns, breathing with the silence. Kael sat motionless, shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on the floor as if answers might grow from the cracks. The room around him was still, but his mind churned with the truth he couldn't bury and the memory he couldn't escape. The door slid open without sound. Lira stepped inside. She didn't pause, didn't ask. Her presence filled the space with something heavier than words. She stood there for a breath, eyes tracing him in the quiet. Then her hands moved calm, fluid undoing the clasps of her armor one by one. It fell around her feet without resistance, and the last layer between them disappeared like a drawn breath let go too late. She crossed to him slowly, not seductively, not carelessly, but with purpose. Like she knew where this would end and chose to walk toward it anyway. Her fingers brushed his face, soft, searching. Her voice barely reached the air. Then stop me now, if what you feel is wrong. But he didn't stop her. Because he couldn't. Because every part of him had already stepped past the point where logic lives. His hands found her waist, her spine, her skin too warm, too close, too familiar. Their lips met without permission, without control, and the kiss they shared wasn't lust. It was surrender. She pressed into him like she'd done it 1,000 times in another life. His mouth memorized her as if he'd been waiting, not days, but years. They moved together in a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud, a silent confession told through touch and trembling breath. The sheets gathered beneath them, forgotten. Time slowed until it disappeared. And in the blur of skin and size, he forgot. He forgot what the blood said. Forgot what the screen revealed. Forgot that the warmth blooming between them came from a bond that never should have existed. But his body remembered. And so did hers. Not in thought. Not in logic. But in that primal echo that lives beneath language where memory lives in flesh. She didn't know. Not yet. But he did. And still, he kissed her like she was the only thing holding him together. And just before the moment faded, just before silence reclaimed the space between their heartbeats, she leaned into the curve of her neck and whispered the one truth he hadn't been able to say aloud. I'm sorry for loving you too late. The wind at the gates moved like a breath held too long. Cold. Waiting. Kael stood near the transport, back rigid, gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the landing pad anywhere but behind him. The air around him was heavy with unspoken farewells. Voices murmured in the distance. Mechanical doors hissed closed, and time slowed to the sound of inevitability. Then came the footsteps. Unsteady. Fast. Breaking the quiet like a fault line. Lira. Her silhouette emerged from the mist of engine vapor and polished steel, her stride urgent, almost frantic. Armor half-fastened, boots clashing against stone, and in her hands something glowing, shaking. The moment their eyes met, he knew she had read it. She didn't stop walking. She didn't slow. She didn't breathe until she was in front of him, fire in her throat and a storm behind her eyes. You knew? She shoved the data slate against his chest. The screen flickered, but the words burned clear. Genetic match, 47% maternal bloodline. Her voice cracked, but she didn't waver. She wasn't asking, she was accusing. You touched me, she choked. You said you loved me. Was it pity? Kael didn't speak right away. He looked at her, not at the screen, not at the slate now falling to the floor, but at her face. The pain there, the betrayal, and the love that hadn't died yet, even now. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper, but it carried. Number. Silence fell between them, thick and shaking. Then he took a breath that sounded like it hurt to make. It was never pity. It was always... His voice faltered for just a second. Something we didn't understand. The words hit her harder than the truth ever had. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, eyes wide, lips parted, chest rising, like she'd forgotten how to hold herself up. The slate slid from her fingers and struck the ground with a dull, hollow sound. Its light dimmed and blinked out. The gate lights shifted, colorboarding sequence initiated, but neither of them moved. Only her voice did. Barely. No longer a shout, no longer a question, just a tremor in the air. Thin, fractured, final. It wasn't the tears that undid her. It was the sound of her voice breaking where love and truth collided. The chamber held its breath. Stone walls, etched with the history of 1,000 verdicts, stood unmoved. Light poured through crystalline arches above clear, cold, without warmth. The council sat in perfect stillness, their robes a seamless blend of tradition and control. Faces expressionless, carved by duty and untouched by time. Kael stood at the center of it, alune-armed, unbound, but not free. Beside him, Lira remained upright, quiet, her composure etched from something more fragile than pride. Her gaze did not waver, though her silence spoke louder than any defense. The lead arbiter did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. This is a violation. The words landed like stone dropped in still water, measured, precise, meant to ripple outward. A corruption of blood, a union never meant to exist. No gasps, no outrage, only the sterile hum of consensus. You will submit to neural erasure, or accept exile beyond the bounds of Zarathai jurisdiction. Two choices, both cold, both irreversible. No questions allowed, no appeals offered. Only the illusion of mercy behind machinery and law. But outside those walls, the silence didn't hold. It cracked. News had already moved faster than decree leaking through systems, passed hand to hand, whisper to whisper, and beyond the council's reach, something had shifted. Not rebellion, not yet, but wonder. Younger voices, scholars, soldiers, heirs began to speak of it not as a crime, but as a signal. A question echoing in the halls of power too long unquestioned. What if this wasn't defilement? What if it was evolution? Not love despite the blood, but love because it defied what blood demanded. The council said nothing, but even silence, in a room that's sacred, becomes a kind of fear. Kael didn't respond. Lira didn't plead. Because there are moments when truth no longer needs a voice. It just needs to be seen. And in that chamber, stripped of defense and surrounded by judgment, they stood side by side, not ashamed, not broken, but whole in a way the law could never comprehend. And somewhere beyond that room, the world had already begun to shift. Because power fears many things, but nothing more than a love it can't unwrite. The launch platform glowed faintly beneath his feet, a low hum resonating through the metal as if the ship itself was bracing for departure. Kael stood just inside the threshold, the open bay behind him humming with the quiet finality of engines coming to life. Lira was only a few steps away, close enough for her presence to flood every part of him, far enough that reaching for her would undo everything. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just looked at her, really looked like he was trying to memorize her outline before the moment collapsed. Her eyes held no anger, only something softer, something heavier. "If I touch you again," he said, barely more than a breath, "I won't leave." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them said all the things they were too late to say. Still, she lifted her hand. Slowly, deliberately, like she wasn't just reaching through air but through time and memory and all the pieces of herself she wasn't ready to let go. Her fingers came to rest against the glass between them. A transparent wall. Thin. Unforgiving. Kael raised his hand to meet hers, palm to palm but never touching. Not truly. Just warmth pressing against cold surface. Just breath fogging opposite sides. Just two people holding on where nothing was allowed to remain. He didn't cry. Neither did she. But something cracked between them. Not loudly. Not violently. Just enough. The engines pulsed brighter. The floor beneath him began to shift. He stayed where he was, hand to hers, frozen in that final stillness until the ship lifted and gravity gave way to silence. She stood there long after he was gone, hands still raised, face unreadable. And in the space he left behind, the air refused to move. Because some goodbyes aren't spoken. Some are felt. In the ache of a touch that never landed, they weren't meant to fall in love. Not by blood. Not by law. Not by the stars that wrote their names in different books. And yet, they did. From the first electric touch in a palace of glass, to the stolen kiss beneath starlight, to the truth that shattered them from the inside out, this was never a love story that asked for permission. It was one that dared to exist anyway. They broke rules. They defied history. They stood in front of a council that called them a mistake. And still, they chose each other. Not because it was easy, but because something deep inside them knew, even if they couldn't stay together, what they felt was real. And sometimes, the things we're told to forget are the very things that change everything. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of their love, the ache of that final goodbye, don't let it be the last. Subscribe, come back, and step into more worlds where love defies fate and the impossible still dares to breathe.